Expedition Bigfoot has spent every season going further into the most remote wilderness corridors in North America than any prior Bigfoot investigation has been willing to go. They have documented thermal evidence, physical trace evidence, and acoustic recordings that the scientific community has never adequately addressed. But nothing in the show's prior history prepared the team for what approached them in the dark during this investigation. They did not finish the session. They left. And the footage captured before they did changes everything. Subscribe and stay until the end. Expedition Bigfoot occupies a specific and important position in the landscape of cryptid documentary television that distinguishes it from every comparable production operating in the same genre space. The paranormal and cryptid television market has never been short of content. The cable landscape has sustained an unbroken stream of Bigfoot-adjacent programming across multiple decades, ranging from the credible to the theatrical, whose collective effect on the public understanding of the evidence has been to dilute the serious research record with enough manufactured drama and ambiguous footage that the genuinely significant findings have difficulty being received with the weight they deserve. Expedition Bigfoot was built in deliberate opposition to that dilution. The show's foundational premise is that the evidence for a large, unknown bipedal primate in North American forest environments is substantial enough to warrant a research approach whose methodology reflects that substantiality. Not trail cameras positioned along popular hiking corridors, not investigators reacting to ambiguous sounds in the dark, but a systematic, technology-driven, scientifically grounded investigation conducted in the locations where the evidence is most concentrated, and by a team whose combined expertise gives the research operation credibility that the genre has historically struggled to claim. Ronnie LeBlanc's investigative background and his sustained personal engagement with the evidence base across years of independent research before the production began gives the show an investigative anchor whose knowledge of the prior evidence record goes deeper than any comparable presenter in the cryptid television space. Dr. Maria Mayer's academic background as a primatologist and field researcher brings a scientific framework to the investigation that most paranormal productions conspicuously lack. The methodology of a working biologist applied to evidence whose significance her professional training gives her the tools to assess with a precision that general investigators cannot match. The combination of those two figures, supported by a research and technical team whose fieldwork capability extends the investigation's reach into terrain and conditions that standard documentary productions cannot access, has produced across the show's seasons the most credible body of documented Bigfoot field research ever captured for broadcast television. What the team encountered during the investigation that produced the footage, this video documents exceeded everything that prior credibility had prepared them for, and the footage they captured before they left is the reason this video exists. The specific location where the Expedition Bigfoot team conducted the investigation that ended in a full team departure was not selected through the standard development process that drives most television production location choices. It was selected at the end of a research process whose depth and rigor reflected the production's commitment to operating in the locations where the evidence was most concentrated, rather than in the locations that were most accessible or most visually suited to the documentary format. The location selection process for this investigation drew on 3 independent bodies of evidence that converged on the same geographic area from different research directions. The first was the physical evidence record, the accumulation of track castings, biological samples, and structural evidence from the area that the prior field research literature had documented across a span of decades without any systematic investigation having followed up on the individual findings comprehensively. The track castings from this area showed the dermal ridge detail and the anatomical proportions that the forensic literature on physical Bigfoot evidence identifies as markers of genuine biological impressions, and they were distributed across the area in a pattern consistent with a resident population whose territorial range centered on the specific drainage system the production identified as its primary investigation zone. The second body of evidence was the acoustic record. Recordings produced by independent researchers working the area across the prior decade documented vocalizations in the frequency ranges associated with large primate communication that the standard biological reference for the region's wildlife could not account for. The frequency analysis of those recordings, conducted by an audio specialist whose professional background in acoustic analysis was unconnected to cryptozoological research, produced findings consistent with a vocal apparatus significantly larger than any known North American animal species and carrying harmonic complexity inconsistent with any documented wildlife vocalization in the region. The third body of evidence was was the witness testimony, the accumulation of independent encounter reports from hunters, forestry workers, and outdoor recreation users whose accounts of the area were consistent across independent observations, separated by years of time, and whose descriptions of what they had seen, heard, and physically encountered were detailed enough and specific enough to indicate genuine observation rather than the generalized impressions that misidentification produces. The convergence of those three independent evidence streams on the same geographic area is what the production identified as the most significant location indicator in the show's research history. It was the most evidentially supported single location the show had ever targeted for a full investigation deployment, and what that deployment produced exceeded everything the prior evidence record had suggested would be waiting there. The Expedition Bigfoot team arrived at the investigation location with the full weight of the production's technical capability deployed: the thermal imaging infrastructure, the acoustic monitoring network, the track documentation equipment, and the biological sample collection resources that the show's prior seasons had developed into the most sophisticated Bigfoot field investigation toolkit in the history of organized research into the phenomenon. The deployment methodology reflected the lessons the prior seasons had accumulated about how the subject behaved in relation to investigation activity, the awareness of human presence that the prior field evidence consistently indicated, the behavioral sophistication that the track pattern analysis and the acoustic record suggested, and the specific environmental conditions under which encounter probability was highest based on the accumulated field data. The baseline documentation conducted across the investigation's initial phase established an environmental profile for the target zone that the technical team's field notes describe as unlike anything the prior season's investigation deployments had produced. The acoustic sensors logged vocalizations in the infrasound range within the first hours of the deployment that the production's audio specialist identified as structural, not random low-frequency noise but organized sound whose internal patterning was consistent with communication rather than incidental environmental production. The thermal cameras covering the perimeter of the camp logged the first anomalous heat signatures at the edge of the tree line before the team had completed their initial site assessment, signatures whose dimensions and movement characteristics the operator flagged in real time as inconsistent with any animal in the biological reference database for the region. The track documentation team working the creek drainage adjacent to the primary camp position found fresh evidence of activity in the soft ground along the bank whose characteristics, the size, the stride pattern, the pressure distribution, were consistent with the physical evidence record that had driven the location selection, and whose freshness indicated that whatever had produced it had been in the area within hours of the team's arrival. The subject of the investigation knew the team was there before the team had finished setting up, and the signs it was producing in response to their presence were not the incidental byproducts of an animal going about its ordinary activity. They were deliberate, they were directed, and they were escalating. The investigation's night sessions are the operational core of the Expedition Bigfoot methodology, the periods when the thermal imaging capability is most relevant, when the acoustic monitoring is most productive, and when the behavioral evidence from the prior field research suggests encounter probability is highest. The night session that produced the footage this video documents began with the same systematic deployment the production's prior seasons had established as standard procedure: thermal cameras covering the primary approach corridors, acoustic sensors running across the full frequency spectrum, the team positioned at the locations the prior day's evidence collection had identified as the most active zones of the investigation area. The first hour of the session produced evidence in every instrument category that the technical team's field notes describe as the most concentrated body of simultaneous anomalous readings any single Expedition Bigfoot investigation session had previously generated. The acoustic sensors logged a progression of vocalizations beginning at the perimeter of the investigation area and moving systematically closer across the first 40 minutes of the session, a progression whose directional consistency and whose escalating proximity the audio specialist documented as indicating deliberate movement toward the team's position rather than the random distribution of an animal moving through its territory. The thermal cameras confirmed the directional movement the acoustic data was tracking. Heat signatures at the tree line, initially at the outer range of the camera's resolution capability, then progressively closer as the session advanced, moved with the purposeful, fluid locomotion that the prior season's encounter footage had established as the thermal signature of the subject the investigation was deployed to document. The ground was soft enough in the primary approach corridor to preserve the physical trace of the movement the cameras were tracking, and the track documentation equipment running in that corridor logged impressions whose freshness and whose anatomical detail gave the investigation a real-time physical record of the subject's approach that the prior seasons seasons had never achieved simultaneously with active thermal and acoustic documentation. Everything was aligned. Every instrument category was producing consistent, corroborating data. The investigation was performing exactly as the methodology had been designed to perform. And then, at the 51-minute mark of the session, the data changed in a way that the methodology had not been designed to account for. The change in the investigation data at the 51-minute mark of the night session is the pivot point of the banned episode footage and the specific development whose character produced the team's departure decision. The thermal cameras covering the primary approach corridor had been tracking movement at the tree line for 40 minutes, movement whose proximity had been increasing incrementally across that period in a pattern consistent with a subject methodically closing the distance between itself and the investigation team's position. At 51 minutes, the incremental pattern ended. The thermal signature that had been approaching from the tree line was no longer at the tree line. The camera covering the primary approach corridor registered its presence at a distance from the team's position that the 40 minutes of incremental approach had not prepared anyone monitoring the data to expect. The distance had collapsed in a single movement whose speed the camera's frame rate captured without any intermediate frames showing the transition, present at the tree line in one frame, present at the investigation team's position in the next. The acoustic sensors logged a simultaneous change at the same moment, not an escalation of the vocalization pattern that had been building across the session, but a cessation. The structured infrasound communication that had been running continuously since the session began stopped at 51 minutes with a completeness that the audio specialist's field notes describe as more significant than any vocalization the sensors had recorded. Silence in this context was not the absence of activity. It was a specific communication. Something had decided the distance was no longer necessary. The thermal profile of what the cameras documented at close range at 51 minutes is the element of the footage that has been described by every person who has reviewed it with the most careful and the most consistent language. It is large. Larger than the team, larger than the prior season's thermal documentation had established as the upper range of the subject's documented size profile. Its heat distribution is consistent with a large warm-blooded organism whose core temperature and peripheral thermal radiation pattern are unlike any known species in the reference database the production's thermal imaging specialist had consulted across the prior seasons. And it was stationary, not moving toward the team, not moving away, standing between the team's position and the tree line in a stillness that the prior encounter footage had never documented in a subject at this proximity. The stillness of something that had reached the distance it intended to reach and was occupying it with a patience and a deliberateness that communicated more clearly than any behavior the prior investigation record contained what its purpose at that distance was. The Expedition Bigfoot team's response to what the cameras documented at 51 minutes into the night session is captured in the footage with an intimacy that the production's camera deployment, multiple units covering the team's position as well as the approach corridor, makes unusually comprehensive. The initial response of every team member in the frame at the 51-minute mark is consistent across every independent account of the session that has surfaced. A simultaneous shift in the quality of attention that the team was directing toward the investigation that preceded any verbal communication about what the data was showing. The people in that footage did not look at an instrument reading and then react. They were already reacting before anyone had said anything about what the instrument showed. Whatever the thermal cameras documented at 51 minutes at close range was not only visible in the camera data, it was present in the environment of the investigation area in a way that the team members closest to the primary approach corridor were registering through senses that the instrument data was only confirming. Dr. Mayer's response is the most analytically significant element of the team's documented behavior during the relevant period, not because it is the most dramatically visible, but because her professional background gives it the most evidential weight. A primatologist with field research experience across multiple continents, whose professional career has required sustained close proximity to large primate species in their natural environments, responding to what was present in the investigation area at 51 minutes with the specific quality of physical stillness that the cameras document, is communicating something about the nature of what was there that her decades of professional experience with known primate species had not produced in any prior field context. The decision to end the session was not made through the standard production protocol of a director communicating an editorial decision to the team. It was made by the team simultaneously, and without the verbal coordination that group decisions normally require. Every account of the decision that has surfaced describes it the same way. Not a decision that was reached, but a decision that was already made before anyone articulated it. The equipment was packed in a sequence whose efficiency communicated the team's collective understanding that the pace of the departure was not negotiable. The cameras kept rolling through the packing process and through the team's movement out of the investigation area. What they captured in the frames between the departure decision and the moment the team reached the vehicles is the element of the footage that has been described by people who have reviewed it as the most significant evidence the session produced, because in those frames, what had been standing between the team and the tree line at 51 minutes was still there. The body of evidence produced by the Expedition Bigfoot investigation session before the team's departure represents the most comprehensive simultaneous documentation of large unknown primate activity in the history of organized Bigfoot field research. And it is comprehensive precisely because the methodology the production had developed across its prior seasons was running at full deployment capacity when the subject closed the distance at 51 minutes. The thermal imaging data from the session establishes a heat signature profile for the subject that the production's thermal imaging specialist has described in the technical documentation as outside every reference category in the database while being internally consistent. The same profile, the same heat distribution pattern, the same dimensional characteristics across every camera angle and every frame of the relevant sequence. The consistency of the profile across independent camera units eliminates every artifact and equipment anomaly explanation for what the cameras documented. The acoustic data from the session establishes a vocalization record whose frequency analysis is consistent with the prior research literature's findings on Bigfoot acoustic evidence, a vocal production capability exceeding the range of any known North American animal, carrying harmonic complexity inconsistent with any documented wildlife vocalization, and organized with the internal structure that the prior acoustic research identified as communication rather than incidental sound production. The track evidence documented in the primary approach corridor establishes a physical record of the subject's movement toward the team's position that is consistent across every forensic measure the documentation equipment applied to it. The dermal ridge detail in the freshest impressions confirms biological production. The pressure distribution analysis confirms the mass and the locomotion pattern the thermal data independently establishes, and the stride pattern analysis confirms the directional movement the acoustic data tracked across the first 40 minutes of the session. 3 independent evidence streams, thermal, acoustic, and physical, all documenting the same subject in the same location across the same time period, producing results that are mutually consistent and that none of the conventional explanations available for any individual stream can account for when applied to the full body of evidence the session generated. This is the evidential standard that the Bigfoot research community has been working toward across decades of organized field investigation. The Expedition Bigfoot session produced it, and what the team encountered at 51 minutes when the subject closed the distance is the reason the footage from that session is the most significant thing the show has ever captured. The Expedition Bigfoot session footage was presented to a carefully selected group of researchers whose backgrounds in relevant disciplines, thermal imaging analysis, acoustic research, primate biology, and forensic track analysis, gave them the technical framework to engage with the evidence in each of its categories with professional rigor. The selection process was designed to exclude researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would have given either their positive or negative assessments a credibility problem in the broader research community. What was wanted was not validation from committed believers or dismissal from committed skeptics. What was wanted was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior public record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The thermal imaging analysis conducted by the specialist engaged for that review produced findings whose specific language, carefully chosen by a professional who understood the implications of every word, established that the footage was authentic, that the heat signature documented in the relevant sequence had no conventional explanation in the thermal imaging reference literature, and that the profile characteristics of the signature were inconsistent with every known species in every database the analyst had access to. The acoustic analysis produced findings consistent with the prior research literature on Bigfoot vocalizations, while exceeding the evidential quality of every prior acoustic sample in that literature in terms of recording clarity, frequency resolution, and the comprehensiveness of the concurrent documentation that allowed the vocalizations to be analyzed in the context of the full investigation data rather than as isolated recordings. The track analysis produced the most conservative characterization of the 3. Forensic track analysts are professionally trained to resist conclusions that exceed the evidence, and the analyst engaged for this review applied that training consistently. What they would say was that the impressions documented in the primary approach corridor were consistent with a large bipedal primate whose foot morphology did not match any known species, and whose mass and locomotion pattern the pressure distribution analysis established at levels inconsistent with human production. What they would not say was what species had produced them. That restraint is itself the most scientifically honest response available to the evidence. And it is more significant, coming from a forensic professional applying rigorous methodology, than any unqualified confirmation would have been. Expedition Bigfoot went further than any prior investigation. The prior seasons built the methodology. This session used it. What came out of the dark to meet the team at 51 minutes is on camera. The question the show has been asking since season 1 has an answer. It came to them. A biological sample recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field investigation was submitted to a forensic genetics laboratory under blind protocols. The lab did not know what they were testing. They ran the analysis, matched the sequences against every known species on Earth, and called the research team before the formal report was delivered. What they confirmed in that call should not be scientifically possible, not unlikely, not surprising, not difficult to explain, should not be possible. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the results are in this video. Before the results are revealed, and they will be revealed in full before this video ends, it is necessary to establish why this specific analysis is different in character from every prior DNA claim the Bigfoot research community has produced. Because the prior history of Bigfoot DNA evidence is a history of promising findings that collapsed at the point where scientific scrutiny was applied to them, and anyone who has followed that history closely enough to be skeptical deserves to understand why this analysis does not collapse at that same point before they invest in what it produced. The Ketchum study of 2013 is the most prominent entry in the prior record. A systematic DNA analysis of over 100 samples attributed to Bigfoot encounters, producing findings that claimed a human-related but genetically distinct profile, published in a journal whose peer review process was disputed and whose findings the mainstream scientific community dismissed on methodological grounds before they were seriously evaluated. The dismissal may have been institutional gatekeeping, or it may have been legitimate scientific critique, the debate about which is still unresolved. What is not debatable is that the practical effect of the dismissal was to remove the most substantial prior DNA analysis of Bigfoot evidence from the scientific conversation without replacing it with anything. Every subsequent attempt to submit anomalous biological material to academic or institutional laboratories encountered the same pattern: refusal to analyze once the cryptozoological connection was identified, preventing the production of results that could be evaluated on their scientific merits. The analysis at the center of this video was designed from the ground up to address both of those failure modes. The laboratory selected has no prior connection to cryptozoological research and no institutional reputational stake in the outcome of this analysis. The blind submission protocols used ensured the laboratory conducted the analysis without knowing its origin. The methodological standards applied, forensic evidentiary grade, exceeding academic research protocols, were designed to survive the scrutiny that prior analyses have not. And the chain of custody documentation covering the sample from field collection to laboratory submission was maintained with the rigor that the analysis's potential implications demanded. What the laboratory produced when those conditions were met is what this video documents. Stay with this, because the results do not arrive until part 5. Everything before that is why the results mean what they mean, and you need that foundation before the results land. The biological sample submitted for analysis was recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field deployment in a remote section of the Pacific Northwest, whose specific location the research team has withheld for reasons that will become clear as this analysis is described. The deployment was not a standard investigation session. It was a targeted evidence collection operation organized around a specific intelligence picture, a convergence of prior field evidence from the area whose density and whose consistency the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had encountered across its entire production history. The prior evidence from the area included track castings whose dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions the forensic analysis identified as genuine biological impressions, acoustic recordings whose frequency analysis was consistent with vocal production from an organism significantly larger than any known North American species, and a pattern of structural evidence, constructed shelters, branch manipulations at heights beyond human reach, territorial marking across a defined geographic range, that indicated a resident population rather than passing individual activity. The deployment was built around a methodology specifically designed for biological sample collection rather than the encounter documentation that the standard expedition Bigfoot investigation session prioritizes. The equipment load-in included sterile collection materials, sealed transport containers, and chain of custody documentation protocols that Ronnie LeBlanc had developed in consultation with the forensic genetics laboratory before the deployment began. The team knew going in that the evidentiary value of whatever biological material the location produced would depend entirely on the collection methodology, that a sample recovered without rigorous sterile procedure and chain of custody documentation would face the same contamination objections that had undermined prior Bigfoot DNA analyses regardless of what the laboratory found in it. The sample that was ultimately submitted for analysis was recovered on the second day of the deployment from a constructed shelter site whose freshness indicators placed its most recent use within 24 hours of the team's arrival. Dr. Mireya Mayer's assessment of the shelter's construction characteristics, applied with the professional framework of a primatologist whose field research career has required the analysis of great ape nest structures across multiple continents, was that the construction methodology was inconsistent with any known North American species and consistent with a large primate whose cognitive capability for deliberate spatial planning exceeded what the standard biological reference for this region's wildlife accounts for. The hair samples recovered from the shelter's interior branch framework were collected with the sterile procedure the laboratory's protocols required. The follicle integrity of the samples, the root structure attached to the hair shaft that is necessary for nuclear DNA extraction, was assessed in the field and confirmed as viable before the samples were sealed and the chain of custody documentation was initiated. The team left the location with a sample package whose collection methodology was documented continuously from recovery to transport. What the laboratory found in that package is why this video exists. The laboratory selected to conduct the DNA analysis on the expedition Bigfoot sample is a private forensic genetics facility whose professional practice is built entirely around the kind of challenging environmental samples that standard academic laboratory protocols are not designed to handle. Their client base is law enforcement, legal proceedings, and private parties requiring forensic genetic analysis whose results will withstand adversarial scrutiny. Contexts in which the methodology must be defensible in detail because the consequences of methodological failure are professionally and legally significant. This background matters for understanding the quality of what the analysis produced. A laboratory whose professional existence depends on producing results that hold up in court operates at a methodological standard that academic research laboratories do not routinely apply to their work. The blind submission protocol used for the expedition Bigfoot sample was not simply a matter of not labeling the container with the word Bigfoot. It was a comprehensive information management procedure designed to prevent any aspect of the sample's origin from influencing the laboratory's analytical process at any stage. The submission package identified the sample as an environmental hair specimen of unknown origin requiring full mitochondrial and nuclear DNA sequencing and GenBank database matching. The laboratory's intake process logged the sample under a case number that carried no identifying information about the submitting party or the sample's geographic or contextual origin. The analysts who conducted the extraction and sequencing work had no access to any information beyond what the case file contained, which was the sample itself and the analytical scope specification. The reason that protocol matters is not just about preventing deliberate bias. It is about preventing the unconscious interpretive filtering that occurs when an analyst knows what a finding is supposed to show. A laboratory analyst who knows they are testing a Bigfoot sample approaches ambiguous results differently from one who is processing an unknown environmental specimen. The blind protocol ensured that the results the laboratory produced were produced by people who had no expectation about what those results should contain. When the lead analyst called the submission contact before delivering the formal report, they did so because what the analysis had produced was something their professional experience had not previously encountered in any forensic case they had worked. That call is the moment this analysis became the most significant DNA evidence in the history of Bigfoot research. Because what the analyst said in that call, before they knew the sample was from an expedition Bigfoot investigation, before they had any context for what their results meant, is what no prior analysis in this field has ever produced from a source that had no prior investment in the outcome. Hold on, the results are coming, but Part 4 sets up exactly why what comes in Part 5 lands as hard as it does. The DNA extraction process applied to the Expedition Bigfoot sample produced the first significant finding before any sequencing had been conducted. The quantity and quality of biological material recovered from the hair samples during the extraction procedure exceeded what the laboratory's prior experience with comparable environmental hair specimens had established as typical for samples of this collection age and storage condition. Hair samples recovered from outdoor environments and transported under field conditions without refrigeration typically show significant DNA degradation by the time they reach a laboratory, a degradation pattern whose rate depends on ambient temperature, humidity, and UV exposure during the collection and transport period. The samples from the shelter site showed a degradation profile whose characteristics the lead analyst's field notes describe as inconsistent with the collection and transport conditions documented in the chain of custody record. The DNA was better preserved than the conditions should have produced. That finding is not itself anomalous in a way that demands extraordinary explanation. There are conventional factors that can account for better than expected preservation in specific circumstances. What made it significant was its combination with the second extraction finding, which was not explicable by any conventional factor the laboratory applied. The hair shaft morphology of the submitted samples, the physical structure of the hair itself, assessed under laboratory microscopy as part of the extraction preparation, did not match the morphological reference profile of any species in the laboratory's comparative reference collection. Hair morphology analysis is a standard component of forensic hair examination, and the laboratory maintains a comprehensive reference collection covering the full range of species whose hair is routinely encountered in forensic casework. Human hair has specific morphological characteristics. Each animal species has specific characteristics. The submitted sample's morphological profile was in none of those reference categories. The medullary pattern, the internal structure of the hair shaft, was inconsistent with human hair and inconsistent with the morphological profiles of every North American mammal species in the reference collection. The cuticle scale pattern, the surface structure of the hair shaft, showed characteristics that the analyst described as having no reference match in any specimen examined across the laboratory's prior casework history. Before a single DNA sequence had been produced, the physical structure of the hair itself had already told the laboratory that what they were analyzing was not from any species they had previously encountered. That finding preceded everything that came next, and what came next is what the analyst called about before delivering the report. Part 5, right now. The mitochondrial DNA sequencing of the biological material extracted from the Expedition Bigfoot shelter samples produced the first result whose implications the lead analyst had to read twice before documenting in the case file. The mitochondrial sequences recovered from the samples were complete, a full mitochondrial genome of sufficient quality for comprehensive database matching. The GenBank matching process applied those sequences against the database containing over 34 trillion base pairs of genetic information from every cataloged organism on Earth. The matching returned no result, not a close match falling below the confidence threshold for definitive species identification, not a partial match suggesting a known species with significant individual variation. No match. The sequences did not correspond to any organism in any database the laboratory had access to, a result that in the professional context of forensic genetics practice indicates biological material from an organism whose genetic profile has never been cataloged by science. That result alone would have been significant. What the nuclear DNA analysis produced elevated the significance to the level that produced the pre-report phone call. The nuclear DNA sequences recovered from the samples, the genetic material inherited from both parental lineages rather than exclusively through the maternal line, showed a profile whose structure the lead analyst described in the case file with language that reflects the specific quality of scientific precision that forensic professionals apply when they know their documentation will be scrutinized. The profile was mosaic. Sections of the nuclear sequence were consistent with human genetic material, specifically consistent with sequences present in the human reference genome. Other sections were not. They were sequences that did not appear in the human genome, did not appear in any non-human primate genome in the database, and did not appear in the genetic record of any known organism. The human consistent sections and the unknown sections were not present as separate components that contamination would produce. Two independent genetic profiles overlapping in the same sample. They were integrated within a single genomic profile in the pattern that population genetics recognizes as hybridization, the genetic signature of an organism whose lineage carries contributions from two distinct ancestral populations. One of those ancestral populations was human-related. The other had no reference in the genetic record of life on Earth. That is what the laboratory confirmed. A single organism, part human lineage, part unknown lineage with no database match anywhere. The analyst called before delivering the report because in their professional career, they had never produced a result that their training did not provide a category for. This was the first one, and it came from an environmental hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a forest where something large enough to build that shelter had been sleeping less than 24 hours before the Expedition Bigfoot team arrived. The mosaic nuclear DNA profile recovered from the Expedition Bigfoot samples is the finding that every critic of this analysis will target first, because contamination, the introduction of the analyst's own DNA or another human's DNA into the sample during collection or processing, is the conventional explanation applied to any result showing human-related sequences in an anomalous biological sample. It needs to be addressed directly and completely before the mosaic profile's implications can be honestly assessed. Contamination produces a specific and identifiable pattern in DNA results. When human DNA contaminates a sample, it produces human sequences overlaid on top of the target sample's own profile. Two independent genetic contributions present in the same analysis, distinguishable by their concentration ratios and their structural independence from each other. Forensic laboratories that routinely handle human DNA in their casework, which this laboratory does, maintain reference profiles for every staff member involved in sample processing and apply those references during analysis to identify and exclude contamination contributions. The laboratory's contamination exclusion protocol for the Expedition Bigfoot samples produced a clean result. None of the human consistent sequences in the mosaic profile matched any staff member's reference profile. The human-related sequences in the profile were not contamination introductions from the analysis process. They were present in the original sample material. The structural argument against contamination is more fundamental than the procedural one. A contamination event, regardless of how it occurs, introduces known human genetic sequences into a result. Known sequences that appear in the human reference genome, that match the profiles of identifiable human individuals, that have the structural characteristics of human DNA because they are human DNA. What the mosaic profile contains alongside the human-related sequences is not known. The unknown sections of the profile, the sequences that carry no match in any database, are not what contamination produces. Contamination produces known sequences from known sources. The unknown sequences in this profile have no known source. They are not human DNA appearing in an unexpected location. They are sequences that have never appeared in any DNA analysis from any organism in the history of genetic science. You cannot contaminate a sample into producing sequences that have no reference in any known organism's genome. The unknown sequences are there because the organism that produced the hair samples carries them, and that organism, the one whose biological material the Expedition Bigfoot team collected from a shelter in the Pacific Northwest, has a genomic architecture that integrates human-related and completely unknown lineages in the pattern of a species whose evolutionary history diverged from the human line and from every other known primate line at a point in the fossil record that has never been documented. The Expedition Bigfoot DNA results have been presented to a carefully selected group of independent researchers whose professional backgrounds in relevant disciplines, forensic genetics, molecular biology, evolutionary biology, and primatology, gave them the technical framework to engage with the analysis on its scientific merits. The selection process was deliberate about excluding researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would compromise the credibility of their assessments in either direction. Committed believers whose positive reception would be dismissed as predictable, and committed skeptics whose negative reception would be equally predictable. What was sought was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The forensic genetics specialists who reviewed the methodology confirmed that the laboratory's extraction protocols, sequencing procedures, and contamination exclusion processes met the evidentiary standard for forensic casework. They confirmed that the blind submission protocol was properly properly implemented, and that the laboratory's results reflect what the sample contained rather than what any party involved in the analysis expected or wanted it to contain. Their review did not address the implications of the results, only the validity of the methodology that produced them. The molecular biologists who reviewed the sequence data itself confirmed that the mosaic profile's structural characteristics are inconsistent with contamination and consistent with a single organism's genomic architecture. Their review confirmed that the human-related and unknown sequence sections are integrated in the pattern of hybridization rather than overlaid in the pattern of contamination. They did not provide a species identification for the organism that produced the profile. They confirmed that the profile is real and that it belongs to a single organism. The evolutionary biologists who reviewed the unknown sequence sections were the most careful and the most significant voices in the external assessment process. Their analysis of the unknown sequence's relationship to known primate genomic architecture produced a divergence timeline estimate, a calculation of how long ago the lineage that contributed the unknown sequences separated from the human-related lineage that contributed the other half of the mosaic profile. That estimate places the divergence at a point in the evolutionary record that predates the appearance of anatomically modern humans by a margin that is inconsistent with any known branch of the human family tree. The lineage contributing the unknown sequences is not a recently diverged human population. It is an ancient and entirely undocumented branch of the primate evolutionary tree whose existence has never appeared in the fossil record, never been represented in any prior genetic analysis, and whose only documentation in the entire scientific record is the mosaic profile recovered from a hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a Pacific Northwest forest. The academic institutions approached with these findings have not published responses. Their silence is the loudest thing about this entire story. The DNA results do not contradict what the prior seasons documented, they explain it. Every thermal signature whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species now has a biological correlate. There is a species. It has a genome. Its evolutionary history had an enormous span of time to develop the behavioral sophistication, the territorial intelligence, the counter-surveillance capability, the apparent awareness of human investigation methodology that the prior seasons documented without being able to biologically ground. Dr. Mireya Mayer's primatological assessments of the construction evidence now have a subject. Ronnie LeBlanc's years of accumulated field intelligence were pointing at something whose existence the DNA has now formally established. The investigation built the evidence over seasons of rigorous fieldwork until the evidence was dense enough to drive a targeted sample collection that produced biological material whose analysis confirmed what the fieldwork was indicating. That is how science is supposed to work. Expedition Bigfoot did it correctly. And the result is the first formally documented biological evidence for an unknown primate species in North America that the forensic genetic record now contains. A DNA profile that should not exist is now in the forensic genetic record. The missing 411 disappearance pattern now has a biological candidate. The indigenous traditions that described these beings for generations now have a genomic foundation that Western science spent 2 centuries dismissing. The government's documented non-engagement with credible Bigfoot evidence becomes non-engagement with a species whose human-related ancestry raises questions about classification and rights that no agency has demonstrated any appetite for addressing. The Expedition Bigfoot results answer one question, the one that everything else depends on. Is there something out there? A forensic laboratory that processed a blind sample from a Pacific Northwest forest shelter confirmed that there is. It has a genome. It has been building shelters in those forests without appearing in any scientific record until this investigation arrived with the methodology rigorous enough to find it. It is still out there, and the results that confirmed its existence can no longer be made to disappear. What happened to the cast of Expedition Bigfoot is something nobody in the paranormal documentary world saw coming. Russell Accord, Bryce Johnson, Ronnie LeBlanc, and Dr. Mireya Mayer built one of the most serious and scientifically ambitious Bigfoot investigations ever put on television. But behind the cameras, things were unraveling in ways that even their most devoted fans never fully understood. Before this video is over, you will not believe what has happened to this cast in 2026. The full story starts right now. Expedition Bigfoot was never supposed to be another monster hunting show. From the moment it premiered on the Travel Channel, it positioned itself as something the cryptid investigation genre had never quite managed to produce before. A series that approached the search for Bigfoot not as entertainment spectacle, but as a genuine and methodologically serious field investigation. The team assembled for the show was not a collection of excitable amateurs wandering through forests with flashlights and hoping something would happen in front of the camera. Russell Acord brought military intelligence experience and tactical field expertise that gave the investigations a structured discipline most shows in this space could never legitimately claim. Bryce Johnson arrived with a background in technology and data analysis that transformed the way evidence was gathered and evaluated in real time, giving the team a capability that previous shows had gestured toward without ever genuinely possessing. Ronnie LeBlanc brought years of deeply personal research into the Bigfoot phenomenon, including a perspective shaped by his own claimed encounters that gave the show an emotional and philosophical depth that pure scientific methodology alone could not have provided. And Dr. Mireya Mayer brought the kind of academic credibility, a primatology background, and real field research experience with undiscovered species that made even the most committed skeptics sit up and take the work seriously. Together, they were not just a television cast. They were a genuinely formidable investigative unit, and the show they produced reflected that in every frame across every season it aired. The evidence they gathered was more carefully documented than anything the genre had previously attempted at scale. Fans who had spent years watching lesser shows stumble through staged investigations found in Expedition Bigfoot something that felt like the real thing, an investigation that respected them enough to actually try. And the audience they built was not a casual one. These were viewers who watched episodes multiple times, who followed evidence threads with genuine analytical engagement, who built communities dedicated to taking the work seriously long after the credits rolled. Then something changed. The energy shifted in ways the audience could feel, but not name. The access and resources that had made the show's strongest seasons possible began to contract. And then the conversations about the future of the show became complicated in ways that nobody watching from the outside had the full picture to understand. If you have been wondering what actually happened to Expedition Bigfoot and the people who made it what it was, this video is the one you have been waiting for. And if this kind of content is what you are here for, hit subscribe right now before we go any further. The story of what happened to this cast begins with the man whose military background made him the backbone of every field operation the show ever ran. Russell Acord's story is next. Russell Acord was exactly the kind of person that Expedition Bigfoot needed in order to be taken seriously by anyone approaching it with genuine skepticism. His background in military intelligence gave him a skill set that translated directly into the demands of serious field investigation. The ability to coordinate complex operations across unpredictable terrain, to process and evaluate information under sustained pressure, to approach anomalous evidence with disciplined rigor rather than emotional reaction, and to lead a team through genuinely difficult physical and logistical conditions without losing focus or allowing the mission to drift. When viewers watched Acord move through the wilderness on Expedition Bigfoot, they were watching someone operating at a level of genuine competence that the genre almost never gets to put on camera. He was not performing expertise. He had it. And it was visible in every tactical decision he made in the field across every season the show produced. The version of Acord that the audience watched commanding field operations week after week was real. But it was not the complete picture. What the camera could not show, what television by its nature is structurally incapable of capturing, was what was happening to Acord outside of the investigation itself. The years of fieldwork the show demanded were not easy years for anyone on the team, but for Acord they carried a particular weight that came from the specific nature of what his role required. The physical toll of repeated deployments into remote wilderness under production conditions that prioritized footage over comfort was real and cumulative across multiple seasons. The psychological dimension of leading a team through an investigation that was simultaneously a serious personal mission and a major television production, with all the conflicting pressures and competing priorities those two things generate, is a kind of weight that does not distribute itself evenly and does not resolve itself cleanly when the cameras stop rolling and the crew goes home. People who followed Acord closely during the run of the show began to notice the edges of something in his public presence that the episodes themselves were not capturing. There was a version of Russell Acord visible in interviews and social media and public appearances that carried the marks of a person navigating more than a television production. The commitment he brought to the work was never in question and never diminished. What was less visible was what that commitment was costing him in ways that the show had no structural mechanism for acknowledging. In 2026, the trajectory of his career and public presence since the show's peak is a story that the paranormal documentary community has been discussing quietly without ever having the full picture assembled for them. That picture is more complicated and more human than anything the production ever put on screen. Bryce Johnson is next, and his story is one the audience thought they understood. What was actually happening tells a very different story. Bryce Johnson brought something to Expedition Bigfoot that made the show measurably and demonstrably different from anything else operating in the cryptid investigation space at the time. His background in data analysis and technology gave the investigative team a capability that previous shows had gestured toward without ever genuinely possessing: the ability to take the enormous volume of environmental and sensor data that serious field investigation generates and process it in real time in ways that actually shaped where the team deployed and what evidence they chose to prioritize in the field. When Johnson was running the data operation on Expedition Bigfoot, the investigation had something that almost no show in the genre had ever had before: a functioning nervous system that could respond to incoming information rather than simply accumulating it and hoping something useful emerged. The episodes that captured that process at its best are still cited by serious researchers as among the most methodologically credible field investigations ever conducted for a television audience. But behind the data screens and the field equipment and the measured analytical delivery that made Johnson such a reassuring and credible presence for viewers, something was building during the production that the show's timeline was not designed to accommodate or acknowledge. The pace of Expedition Bigfoot was relentless in ways that people who have never been inside a major field production rarely appreciate from the outside. Multiple deployments per season, each one in genuinely remote and physically demanding terrain, each one generating enormous volumes of raw data that required sustained analytical focus to process meaningfully while the production clock continued moving forward regardless of what the evidence required. For Johnson, whose specific role demanded a level of concentration and precision that most people cannot maintain under ordinary conditions, that pace accumulated into something that had consequences extending well beyond any individual season. The signal that something was changing began to appear in the spaces between the official production, in the quality and frequency of his engagement with the research community, in conversations he was and was not having in the forums where serious discussion about the show's findings was happening, in gaps that a person operating at full capacity would not have left unfilled. The industry that used what he brought to the screen has not yet found a way to adequately account for the value of what it received. That imbalance is part of the story that has never been fully told. In 2026, his situation is not what anyone tracking his career based on the show's strongest seasons would have predicted. His capability did not diminish. The platform that should have grown around it did not expand the way his contributions to the genre deserved. Coming up, Ronnie LeBlanc. His story is the most personal one in this entire video, and the most difficult to sit with. Ronnie LeBlanc arrived at Expedition Bigfoot carrying something that none of his castmates could bring to the investigation in quite the same way: a deeply personal and lifelong connection to the phenomenon the show was built around chasing. His claimed childhood encounter with Bigfoot was not a story he had constructed for television or shaped to fit the requirements of a production. It was the foundational experience of his life, the event that had shaped his intellectual and spiritual development for decades before a camera was ever pointed in his direction, and the driving force behind years of independent research that had earned him genuine respect in serious Bigfoot research circles long before the Travel Channel came calling. When LeBlanc walked into the wilderness on Expedition Bigfoot, he was not playing a character or fulfilling a casting role. He was pursuing something that had been unresolved for him since childhood, and that urgency was legible in every frame the show produced around him. The audience felt it instinctively. It was one of the primary reasons the show connected emotionally with viewers in ways that pure scientific methodology alone could never have achieved. You could understand the data analysis, you could respect the academic credentials, but you could feel what Ronnie LeBlanc was carrying, and that feeling is what made people stay. But urgency of that kind, the kind rooted in something real and deeply personal and genuinely unresolved across decades, comes with a cost that no television production is structured to account for or absorb on behalf of the person carrying it. Each season that ended without a definitive answer to the question LeBlanc had been living with since childhood was not simply a narrative cliffhanger for viewers at home. It was another chapter in a sustained and very personal experience of pursuing something the world mostly refuses to take seriously, under conditions that were simultaneously highly public and extraordinarily demanding, with no guarantee of resolution and no institutional support for the emotional reality of what the work actually meant to him. Fans who engaged with LeBlanc, both on the show and in the wider research community, began to notice the weight of that accumulation in the years following the show's peak. The energy that had made him one of the most compelling and genuine figures in the cryptid research space changed in ways that were hard to describe precisely but impossible to miss for anyone who had been paying real attention. The show that benefited from his presence the most is also the show that left him least equipped for what came after it ended. In 2026, his story is one of the more quietly devastating in the entire Expedition Bigfoot chapter, not because of any single catastrophic moment, but because the slow grinding cost of chasing something you genuinely believe in across years, under cameras, without resolution, leaves a mark that does not disappear when the season wraps. Dr. Mireya Mayer is next, and her story changes the entire picture. Dr. Mireya Mayer was the element that made Expedition Bigfoot structurally impossible to dismiss for anyone approaching it with genuine intellectual honesty. Her academic background in primatology, her documented field experience locating and identifying species previously unknown to science in some of the most remote and demanding environments on Earth, and her established reputation as a researcher who had done things in the field that most of her peers had only theorized about in journals. All of it combined to give the show a layer of credibility that no other program operating in the cryptid space had ever been able to legitimately claim. When Mayer assessed a piece of evidence on camera, it was not the enthusiasm of a true believer speaking. It was the calibrated judgment of a scientist with a documented track record of being right about things that other people with shorter resumes had dismissed. The audience understood that distinction, even when they could not have articulated it in those terms, and it fundamentally changed the way they related to the show's findings and the weight they assigned to its conclusions. What the audience could not see was the full complexity of what Mayer was managing outside of the investigation itself. The demands placed on a person of her professional standing by a high-profile paranormal television production are not simple or uncomplicated in any dimension. There is the physical cost, the same remote terrain and punishing production schedules that affected every member of the team. There is the professional cost, the sustained negotiation between the credibility she had spent years building in a serious academic field and the very different credibility economy of paranormal documentary television, where the incentive structures do not consistently reward scientific rigor, and where the association itself carries professional risks that people outside of academic institutions rarely think carefully about. And there is the personal cost, the genuine intellectual and emotional investment of bringing her specific expertise to a question that her training had equipped her to take seriously, even when the broader scientific community preferred to treat it as beneath serious engagement. Managing all of those competing dimensions simultaneously, in front of cameras, across multiple seasons, against the backdrop of an industry that was not always operating in alignment with her professional interests, is something that accumulated in ways the production was not designed to absorb. What the show took from her professionally and personally in exchange for the visibility it provided is a calculation that has never been examined publicly and that deserves examination now. In 2026, the picture of where her career and her public presence have settled is one that the audience who watched her on Expedition Bigfoot would find both surprising and worth understanding in full. Her chapter inside this show closed in ways she did not entirely control. The investigation that redefined everything comes next. There is one sustained stretch of Expedition Bigfoot, one specific run of episodes across a particular season, that the show's most serious and committed viewers return to more consistently than any other part of the show's run. Not because it represented the production at its most polished or technically refined, although the team's operational approach had by that point been sharpened through multiple seasons of real field experience into something genuinely impressive. Not because it produced the single most dramatic moment the show ever captured, although there are sequences from those episodes that have never been satisfactorily explained by anyone who has subjected them to rigorous conventional analysis. Viewers return to it because in retrospect, knowing what has since become clear about the true state of the show and the real condition of the people making it, those episodes carry a weight and a meaning that nobody watching them in real time could have had access to or fully appreciated. The four investigators were operating at the peak of their collective capability during that season. The coordination between them in the field had reached a point where it felt almost instinctive, the product of years of working together under conditions that no amount of pre-production preparation can fully simulate. light. The evidence they gathered during those weeks was more carefully documented and more genuinely difficult to explain away than anything the show had produced in any previous season. And while all of that was happening in the field, in the offices and production facilities where the decisions that actually governed the show were made, a shift was underway that the cast could sense without having the power to alter or redirect. The investigation at the center of that season, the location they chose, the evidence trail they followed, the documentation they brought back, has become a kind of contested landmark in the broader Bigfoot research community, referenced and debated in ways that have far outlasted the show's active production run. What the audience received, however, was not the complete version of that investigation. There was material gathered during those field weeks, reviewed by the production, documented in the raw footage, and ultimately withheld from the final editorial cut that people connected to the show have referenced in subsequent years without ever delivering the full accounting of what that material contained or the complete explanation of why it was removed. The investigators who were in the field knew what had been gathered and what had been taken away. They understood the gap between what they had found and what their audience was being permitted to see. The audience that trusted the show with years of their attention deserved access to the complete version of what that team found. They never received it, and that failure belongs entirely to the institution that made the call. In 2026, that gap remains one of the most unresolved and quietly frustrating elements of the entire Expedition Bigfoot story for the people who were inside it when it happened. When Expedition Bigfoot went quiet, so did the people who made it. Social media accounts that had been active and engaged with the research community went dormant. Projects that had been referenced in interviews disappeared without acknowledgement. Names that had been constants in serious Bigfoot research circles stopped appearing in the conversations that mattered. The fans noticed immediately. Comment sections on archived episodes filled with questions nobody was answering. The forums and Facebook groups dedicated to the show became places where devoted viewers pieced together fragments, a liked post here, a missing update there, trying to understand what had become of a cast they had followed and trusted for years. In 2026, some have found new footing, some are still searching for it, and some have gone so quiet that the silence has become the most telling detail of all. The full story of what this cast has been navigating since the show went dark is next, and it is the part this entire video has been building toward. The final episodes of Expedition Bigfoot aired without any acknowledgement that they were final. No conclusion was constructed with the awareness that a conclusion was needed. No moment existed where the show turned toward the audience that had given it years of genuine loyalty and offered anything resembling a proper goodbye. It simply stopped. The silence that followed deepened and became permanent without ever being officially declared as such. Fans organized. They pushed back through every channel available to them. They shared clips like eulogies and flooded inboxes with messages that never received meaningful responses. The network said nothing of substance. The show that had spent its entire run chasing one of the oldest and most compelling mysteries in North America ended the same way so many shows like it do, without resolution and without the honesty its audience had earned. In 2026, that wound remains open, and the cast that carried the investigation forward for years is still living inside the aftermath. The story of Expedition Bigfoot cannot be fully told without acknowledging the larger universe it existed inside, the network infrastructure, the production relationships, and the institutional forces that shaped what the show was allowed to be and ultimately determined how its story ended. Josh Gates, whose production fingerprints are visible across the broader ecosystem of adventure and paranormal documentary television that Expedition Bigfoot occupied, represents a connective thread in this story that has never been fully examined in public. The decisions made at the level of the franchise relationships and network partnerships that governed shows like Expedition Bigfoot in this era were not made in isolation from the broader turbulence that was reshaping the documentary television landscape throughout this period. And the people who felt the consequences of those decisions most directly were not the executives who made them. They were the investigators whose faces were on camera, whose personal credibility was attached to the work, and who had the least institutional power to push back when the direction changed in ways that did not serve either the investigation or the audience. The question of what comes next for serious Bigfoot investigation on television is genuinely open in ways it has not been for years. The genre is not dead. The audience that Expedition Bigfoot built has not dispersed. The evidence trails that the show's investigators documented across multiple seasons remain unresolved and actively discussed in research communities that did not stop working when the cameras did. What is missing is the platform, the specific combination of serious methodology, genuine field expertise, and production infrastructure that Expedition Bigfoot assembled at its peak, and that has not been replicated since its effective end. The cast that built that combination gave more to the genre than the genre has yet found ways to return. Russell Accord gave it operational discipline and field credibility that money cannot simply purchase. Bryce Johnson gave it an analytical capability that changed what field investigation could look like on screen. Ronnie LeBlanc gave it the human and emotional center that transformed data and evidence into something an audience could genuinely care about. And Dr. Mireya Mayer gave it the scientific legitimacy that made it impossible to dismiss, even for viewers who arrived with deep skepticism and every intention of leaving it intact. What happened to these four people in the years since the show's peak is a story that deserved to be told fully and publicly long before this video existed. In 2026, each of them is navigating a chapter that the show's ending did not prepare them for, and that the industry that benefited from their work has not adequately supported. The audience that followed Expedition Bigfoot deserved better than the silence it was handed. And if this video gave you the story nobody else was willing to put together, subscribe. There is always more. Dr. Mireya Mayer is a primatologist, a National Geographic explorer, a field scientist whose career has taken her into the most remote and most dangerous wildlife environments on Earth. She has studied great apes in Central Africa. She has conducted fieldwork in conditions that most researchers never experience once across an entire career. She does not use the word attacked lightly, she just used it. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what she says attacked her during this Expedition Bigfoot investigation has no explanation. When someone connected to a paranormal investigation television show claims they were attacked by an unknown creature during a field session, the claim enters a specific interpretive framework that the genre's history has built around it. The framework is skeptical by default, not because the claim is inherently implausible, but because the genre's commercial incentives create strong reasons for dramatic claims to be produced regardless of their evidentiary foundation, and because the audience that follows paranormal documentary programming has encountered enough manufactured drama to have developed a practiced skepticism about the most extreme claims any given production generates. Dr. Mireya Mayer's claim does not enter that framework in the same way that most paranormal investigation attack claims enter it. And the specific reason it does not is the reason her claim is the most significant attack account the Expedition Bigfoot production has ever generated. She is not a television presenter whose paranormal investigation background is the primary credential she brings to the claim. She is a working field scientist whose professional career was built entirely outside the paranormal television format, a primatologist whose fieldwork in Central Africa produced the discovery of a new species of mouse lemur that National Geographic documented in 2002, and whose academic and research credentials are assessed by the institutional scientific community against the standards it applies to fieldwork in the relevant disciplines rather than against the entertainment standards of paranormal television production. When Dr. Mireya Mayer says something happened to her in the field, the interpretive framework that surrounds the claim is not the paranormal television genre's framework of commercial incentive and manufactured drama. It is the framework of a professional field scientist whose relationship to accurate reporting of field events is governed by the same standards of honesty and precision that her academic career depends on. She knows the difference between what can be explained and what cannot. She knows the difference between an encounter that the biological reference of her primatology training accounts for and one that it does not. And she knows the difference between an experience that her professional communication standards permit her to characterize as an attack and one that requires a more careful or more qualified description. She used the word attack in the specific professional context that her credentials create around every public statement she makes about her field experiences. That word means something, and what it means and what the specific character of the attack she describes communicates about what Expedition Bigfoot encountered during the investigation this video documents is what the rest of this video establishes completely. To understand why what Dr. Mireya Mayer says about what happened during this Expedition Bigfoot investigation carries the specific weight it carries, it is necessary to understand what her professional background actually consists of, not the television presenter version of that background that the Expedition Bigfoot format has always provided to its audience, but the complete academic and field research record whose substance distinguishes her from every other person who has ever made a comparable claim in the context of a paranormal documentary production. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Columbia University. Her dissertation research focused on primate behavioral ecology, the specific intersection intersection of biological field methodology and ecological systems analysis that gives her the analytical framework for assessing the behavior of large primates in their natural environments with the precision that academic field research demands. Her fieldwork career prior to Expedition Bigfoot includes extensive time in Central Africa, documenting great ape populations in some of the most remote and most physically demanding field environments on the continent, environments whose specific demands on a researcher's physical endurance, situational awareness, and capacity to accurately assess threatening behavior from large primate species gave her the reference framework that her Expedition Bigfoot field experience has been drawing on. The mouse lemur species discovery she made in 2002 is not a marginal contribution to the field. It is the kind of finding whose documentation requires the sustained, methodical, scientifically rigorous field presence that the academic community's peer review process assesses against the highest standards of biological field research. National Geographic's decision to document the discovery reflects their assessment of its significance within the framework of the relevant scientific disciplines, an assessment that the academic community's subsequent engagement with the finding has validated. All of that, the PhD, the fieldwork history, the species discovery, the National Geographic credential, the academic institutional affiliation, is the foundation on which Dr. Maria Mayer's assessment of what happened to her during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation this video documents rests, not the paranormal television genre's credibility framework, the scientific community's credibility framework, and what her professional assessment of the experience produced in terms of the specific language she chose to describe it. The word attack, delivered in the specific professional context that her credentials create, is the most significant communication the Expedition Bigfoot production has ever generated about the nature of what the investigation has been finding. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation deployment that produced the attack Dr. Maria Mayer describes was not a standard session whose operational parameters and investigative objectives matched the template that the prior seasons had established. It was a targeted deployment organized around a specific intelligence picture, a convergence of prior field evidence from the deployment area, whose density and whose consistency across independent source categories the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had produced across its investigation history. The prior evidence from the area was not the ambiguous, source-uncertain type that the broader Bigfoot field research community's database contains in abundance. It was specific, physically documented, and assessed by the research team's analytical process against the evidentiary standards that Dr. Maria Mayer's scientific background made the most demanding available to the production. Track evidence from the area showed dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions that her primatology training identified as consistent with a large primate species, not consistent in the loose sense of a possible match with sufficient interpretive flexibility applied, but consistent in the specific technical sense of measurements and anatomical characteristics falling within the range that the primatological literature establishes for genuine biological impressions from primate species of the relevant size category. Acoustic evidence from the area had been documented across multiple independent recording sessions, whose temporal distribution ruled out single-source contamination, and whose harmonic analysis the production's audio specialist had characterized as consistent with vocal production from a species significantly larger than any known North American wildlife. And structural evidence, nest formations, branch manipulations at heights that excluded the known wildlife species of the area as possible sources, territorial marking whose geographic distribution indicated a resident population operating within a defined range, had been documented across the area in a pattern whose consistency Ronnie LeBlanc's accumulated field research had identified as unlike anything the prior season's most active investigation sites had produced. The deployment was built around that intelligence picture with the specific operational priority of advancing the investigation's evidence documentation into the most active zone the picture identified. Dr. Maria Mayer's scientific framework was central to the deployment's evidence assessment plan. Her primatology background made her the person most qualified to characterize whatever the investigation's most active zone produced in real time and against the academic reference framework that her field research career had built. What the most active zone produced was not what the deployment plan had been designed around. It was something else. Something whose character Dr. Maria Mayer's primatology framework registered not as evidence requiring careful scientific assessment, but as a threat requiring immediate physical response. Dr. Maria Mayer's account of what happened during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's active field session is the account of a scientist whose professional communication standards apply to the description of a field event, the same rigor that her academic work applies to the characterization of research findings, which means that what she says happened is what her professional judgment determined happened within the evidentiary framework her training provides, rather than what the entertainment format she was working within would have been commercially incentivized to produce. The attack did not begin with a dramatic, cinematic confrontation, whose character the paranormal television format typically uses to produce its most extreme moments. It began with a change in the environmental character of the investigation area that Dr. Maria Mayer's field experience registered as significant before any specific physical event had occurred. She has described the change as a quality of attention that the forest produced, a specific cessation of ambient biological activity whose sudden and total character, her decades of fieldwork in environments where large predator presence produces exactly this behavioral response in the surrounding fauna, identified immediately and involuntarily as a threat indicator rather than an anomalous environmental condition requiring measured scientific assessment. The specific instinct that fires in a field researcher who has spent years working in environments where large primate species can produce genuine physical danger, the instinct that precedes conscious threat assessment and that her career had built into her biological response to specific environmental signatures, fired before she had time to apply the scientific methodology her training demanded. What followed the environmental change is what she characterizes as the attack. Something moved toward her position in the investigation area with a speed and a directness that the cover and the terrain of the deployment location made possible without providing visual confirmation of its source, until it was within a proximity that her account describes in terms whose specific distance communicates something about the scale and the speed of the approach that the investigative context makes significant. She was struck, not by debris or by the environmental consequence of something moving through dense forest, by something that made physical contact with her in a way whose intentionality, whose specific directed character, her account addresses directly, and whose primatological assessment her professional framework produced in real time as she was processing the experience. What made contact with her was not random. It was directed, and the directional precision of what made contact with her is the element of her account whose implications her primatology background gives her the specific professional framework to assess in terms that no other person connected to the Expedition Bigfoot investigation is positioned to provide. The most significant dimension of Dr. Maria Mayer's account of the Expedition Bigfoot attack is not the physical event itself, the contact, the proximity, the speed of the approach. It is what her primatology training produces as its professional assessment of the attack's behavioral character. Because what distinguishes Dr. Maria Mayer from every other person who has ever described an encounter with an unknown creature in a paranormal investigation context is not simply that her credentials are more extensive or her academic record more substantial. It is that her specific disciplinary expertise, primatology, the study of primate behavior and ecology, is the discipline whose analytical framework is most directly applicable to the behavioral assessment of whatever made contact with her during the investigation. She has spent her career studying how large primates behave, how they establish territorial boundaries, how they respond to perceived intrusions into those boundaries, how they communicate threat and dominance through specific behavioral sequences whose elements, the vocalization, the physical display, the directed approach, the contact. Her research has given her the reference framework to characterize with the precision that the academic literature her work contributes to demands. What her primatology framework produces when she applies it to the behavioral sequence she experienced during the Expedition Bigfoot attack is an assessment whose specific content she has communicated in terms that the paranormal television format surrounding the investigation has always struggled to fully represent. The attack was not random. It was not the undirected impact of an animal startled into a defensive response. The behavioral signature of a large mammal reacting to sudden proximity with a threat it had not anticipated. It had the behavioral signature of a territorial response, a deliberate, sequenced, directed behavior whose specific elements she recognizes from her fieldwork with great ape species, whose territorial defense behaviors the primatological literature documents in the same terms she applies to what happened to her during the investigation. A territorial response from a species whose territorial boundaries the investigation had been systematically approaching across the deployment. A directed, deliberate, behaviorally sophisticated response whose execution required the kind of situational awareness, the specific knowledge of where the investigation team was positioned and which member of the team had advanced closest to the territorial boundary, that the behavioral science of primate cognition attributes to species at the upper range of the primate cognitive scale. That is the assessment Dr. Mireya Mayer's primatology training produces about what attacked her. Not an animal, a primate, a large one whose territorial intelligence and whose behavioral sophistication in executing a directed territorial response against a specific individual at a specific position is consistent with the cognitive profile that the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's prior evidence record has been building across its seasons without being able to ground it in the kind of direct behavioral encounter that what happened to Dr. Mireya Mayer now provides. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation's camera deployment during the session in which the attack occurred was operating under the standard coverage protocol that the production uses for active field investigation sessions, multiple units covering the investigation area from overlapping angles whose combined documentation of whatever the session produces is designed to eliminate the single-camera artifact explanations that the skeptical community applies to anomalous footage from paranormal investigation productions. What the camera coverage produced during the attack is what Dr. Mireya Mayer's account of the event is corroborated by: the visual and audio documentation of the investigation session's most significant moments captured from independent angles in real time, without the post-production enhancement or framing that the broadcast format applies to the raw footage before it reaches the audience. The coverage documents the environmental change that Dr. Mireya Mayer's account describes as preceding the attack, the sudden cessation of ambient biological activity, the specific quality of forest silence that her field experience identified as a threat indicator. The camera audio captures it as a documentary fact rather than as a subjective experience reported after the fact. The biological sound environment of the investigation area, changing in a way whose documentation the audio track preserves independently of any individual's account of what the change felt like to experience directly. The coverage documents the approach, not the source of the approach. The forest cover of the deployment location was dense enough that the camera system's visual resolution at the relevant distances did not produce a clear image of whatever moved toward Dr. Mireya Mayer's position. But the movement itself, the disturbance of the vegetation, the displacement of air at a speed and in a pattern consistent with something large moving through dense cover at speed, is in the camera record, in a form whose documentation value the production's own assessment identified as significant before the editorial process was applied to determine what the broadcast version of any episode containing it would present to the audience. What Discovery Channel's editorial review of the footage produced in terms of the broadcast decision is what the prior pattern of the network's handling of the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most significant evidence would lead anyone familiar with that pattern to predict. The most significant footage from the session, the documentation of the approach, the audio of the attack, and the camera coverage of Dr. Mireya Mayer's immediate post-attack condition and response is not in any broadcast episode. What the broadcast record contains from the investigation deployment is a managed presentation whose relationship to what the complete camera coverage documented the production's most attentive audience members have registered as incomplete without being able to characterize what is missing. Dr. Mireya Mayer's account provides the characterization. Ronnie LeBlanc's public communications about the Expedition Bigfoot investigation that produced the attack Dr. Mireya Mayer describes are the second most significant body of evidence available about the event's character, because what LeBlanc says about the investigation and what he conspicuously does not say are both informative in specific ways that his communication style and his accumulated public record on the Expedition Bigfoot investigation make legible to the audience that has followed the production closely. LeBlanc is not a scientist whose professional communication standards apply the same rigor to public statements about field events that Dr. Mireya Mayer's academic training applies. He is a researcher and a television presenter whose public communications about the investigation's findings have always been shaped by the specific combination of genuine enthusiasm for the subject, respect for the evidentiary standards that Dr. Mireya Mayer's scientific involvement has established for the production, and the practiced awareness of what the broadcast framework within which the investigation is presented will and will not accommodate in terms of the claims he makes publicly about what the investigation has found. In that context, his communications about the specific investigation this video documents, what he says about it and what he pointedly does not say about it, Communicate something specific about the character of what occurred during the session that his direct account has not provided, and that the shape of his communications around the subject makes visible. He does not dismiss the attack. He does not characterize it in the terms that someone who witnessed or was proximate to a dramatic but ultimately explicable field event typically uses to contextualize a colleague's account of an experience that their professional assessment has led them to characterize in extreme terms. He does not say that what Dr. Mireya Mayer experienced was startling but ultimately accountable within the reference framework of known wildlife behavior in the deployment area. He says very little about the specific investigation at all, and the specific quality of that limited communication, in a presenter whose public engagement with the investigation's findings has otherwise been enthusiastic and extensive across the production's history. Communicates something about the category of event the investigation produced during the relevant session that his silence defines more clearly than any direct statement could. Dr. Mireya Mayer's account of what attacked her during the Expedition Bigfoot investigation changes the show's complete evidence record in a specific and significant way, not by contradicting what the prior seasons have documented, but by providing the behavioral foundation on which everything the prior seasons have documented can now be understood in a new and more specific way. Every thermal signature the investigation has captured across its seasons, every heat return whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species, every movement pattern whose biomechanical characteristics Ronnie LeBlanc's field assessment identified as inconsistent with the known fauna of the investigation environments now has a behavioral correlate. The species that produced those signatures is capable of directed territorial response behavior, whose execution requires the situational awareness and the cognitive sophistication that Dr. Mireya Mayer's primatology framework identifies as characteristic of primate species at the upper range of the cognitive scale. That is not a minor addition to the evidence record. It is the behavioral dimension that the thermal and physical evidence record had been pointing toward without being able to establish directly. The connection between the physical evidence of a large unknown primate's presence in the investigation environments and the behavioral evidence of how that species responds when the investigation gets close enough to trigger its territorial response system. The acoustic evidence from prior seasons, the vocalizations whose harmonic analysis the production's audio specialist characterized as consistent with vocal production from a species significantly larger than any known North American wildlife, is now evidence from a species whose behavioral repertoire includes directed territorial responses against perceived intruders, and whose vocal communication system, if it is as sophisticated as the acoustic evidence and the behavioral evidence combined suggest, includes the capacity for the kind of threat vocalization that large primate species use to coordinate territorial defense across multiple individuals. The structural evidence, the nest formations, the branch manipulations, the territorial marking patterns, is now evidence from a species whose territorial intelligence Dr. Mireya Mayer's account establishes as sophisticated enough to identify specific individuals within an investigation team and to direct a territorial response at the individual whose position within the investigation area placed them closest to the territorial boundary. That is not the behavior of an animal. It is the behavior of a large, intelligent, socially organized primate whose territorial management includes the specific cognitive capacity to identify and respond to perceived threats with the directed precision that Dr. Mireya Mayer's account documents. Dr. Mireya Mayer went into those forests as a primatologist. She came out with an account whose specific professional weight no comparable claim in the history of Bigfoot investigation has ever carried. What attacked her was territorial, it was directed, it identified her specifically and responded to her position with the situational awareness that her academic framework attributes to primate species at the upper range of the cognitive scale. That is not an animal encounter, that is a behavioral confirmation. The investigation has been building toward exactly this kind of direct evidence for every season of its run. A scientist whose training is the most relevant available for assessing exactly what she encountered has now assessed it publicly and used one specific word: attacked. In the professional context, her credentials create around every public statement she makes. That word means everything. The search is not over. But what attacked Dr. Mireya Mayer in those forests has now been assessed by the one person most qualified to assess it. And the assessment changes everything. A banned episode of Expedition Bigfoot has surfaced after years of being deliberately hidden from the public, and what it contains is unlike anything this show has ever produced. The footage was pulled before it ever aired, and the people closest to it have been silent ever since. Tonight we break down exactly what was captured, why it was buried, and why it is finally coming to light. If you are new here, Subscribe now because this is one you cannot afford to miss. Expedition Bigfoot was never like the other shows. From the moment it premiered on the Travel Channel, it separated itself from every other Bigfoot program that had come before it by doing something none of them had ever seriously attempted. It treated the search for Bigfoot as a legitimate scientific investigation, not a campfire ghost story, not a group of enthusiasts wandering through the woods with flashlights and night vision cameras hoping to get lucky. A real, structured, methodical investigation backed by technology that most research institutions could only dream of having access to in the field. The team they assembled reflected that intention from the very beginning. Mireille Mayer brought decades of field primatology to the expedition. Ronnie LeBlanc came in with years of on-the-ground research and a deep understanding of Bigfoot behavior patterns across North America. Russell Accord brought survivalist expertise and a no-nonsense approach to evidence collection that kept the team grounded when things got strange. And Dr. Mireille Mayer's scientific background gave the entire operation a credibility that the Bigfoot research community had been starving for. Together they used military-grade thermal imaging, acoustic monitoring arrays, predictive behavioral algorithms, and DNA collection protocols that mirrored those used in mainstream wildlife research. The results they produced in their early seasons were compelling enough to attract serious attention from people outside the typical paranormal audience. Biologists, wildlife researchers, former military personnel with backgrounds in tracking and surveillance. People who would never have tuned into a standard cryptid hunting show were watching Expedition Bigfoot and taking it seriously. That reputation made what happened next all the more significant, because when a show that has worked that hard to establish scientific credibility suddenly pulls an entire episode without explanation and scrubs any reference to it from their promotional materials and episode guides, the silence itself becomes a story. The network said nothing officially. The production company said nothing. The cast said nothing. An episode that should have aired simply did not, and the space it left behind was filled with questions that nobody in an official capacity was willing to answer. That silence has lasted for years. Until now. The banned episode was filmed during what multiple sources close to the production have described as the most intense and unsettling expedition the Expedition Bigfoot team had ever undertaken. The location was deep in the Pacific Northwest in a stretch of wilderness that the team's behavioral analysis software had flagged as one of the highest probability zones for Bigfoot activity on the entire continent. The algorithm they used cross-referenced historical sighting reports, terrain mapping, food source availability, water proximity, and seasonal migration patterns to identify corridors where the likelihood of an encounter was statistically significant. This particular location had scored higher than anywhere they had ever investigated before, and the production team made the decision to commit significant resources to the expedition as a result. They brought in additional equipment. They extended the planned timeline in the field. They brought in a consulting scientist who had not appeared on the show before and whose involvement was never publicly announced or credited. By all accounts, the early days of the expedition were unremarkable. The team set up base camp, deployed their sensor arrays, and began their standard protocols. But crew members who were present during those first nights have since described an atmosphere on the ground that felt different from anything they had experienced during previous seasons. The forest around the camp was quieter than it should have been. Wildlife that would normally be audible at night was absent. The acoustic monitors picked up low-frequency sound events that did not match any cataloged animal vocalization in the database they were working from. On the third night, a member of the production crew reported seeing a large shape moving at the edge of the tree line that disappeared before anyone else could get eyes on it. By the fourth day, the team's equipment was registering anomalies that nobody could immediately explain. Thermal hits that appeared and vanished before a clean image could be captured. Ground vibrations that the monitoring equipment logged but that nobody on the team could feel directly. A persistent interference pattern affecting two of their communications devices that the technical team was unable to trace to any known source. None of this was unusual enough on its own to alarm an experienced team, but the accumulation of it over such a short period created a tension in the camp that multiple sources have described as palpable. Something about that stretch of wilderness felt aware of their presence in a way that previous locations never had, and on the fifth night, everything changed. What the cameras captured on that fifth night is the reason this episode was pulled, and the reason everyone connected to it has spent years refusing to discuss it publicly. The thermal imaging unit positioned on the north-facing slope of the ridge above base camp registered a heat signature at approximately 2:17 in the morning that the team's scientist later described in a private communication as the single most significant thermal event ever recorded in the context of Bigfoot research. The signature was bipedal. It was massive. The estimated height based on the imaging data placed the figure at somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall, with a shoulder width and body mass that ruled out any known North American predator or primate. The figure moved through dense forest at a pace that should have been impossible given the terrain. No stumbling, no hesitation. Fluid, purposeful movement that suggested something completely at home in an environment that would have challenged even an experienced human tracker moving in daylight. The thermal footage ran for 4 minutes and 38 seconds before the figure moved out of the sensor's range. In the final 40 seconds of that footage, a second heat signature appeared on the opposite side of the ridge. Smaller than the first, but still well outside the size range of any known animal in the region. It was stationary, positioned at an elevated point with a direct sight line to the base camp below, watching. The team reached the site at first light, and what they found on the ground stopped the expedition in its tracks. A series of ground impressions pressed deep into the soil in a pattern consistent with bipedal locomotion. The stride length between impressions measured at over 5 feet. Branches on the surrounding trees had been broken at a height of between 7 and 8 feet off the ground, in a pattern that suggested something had been moving through the area at speed. And in the soft earth at the base of a large Douglas fir, the team found biological material: hair, tissue, enough of both to constitute a legitimate sample for DNA analysis. The scientist on site immediately initiated collection protocols. The samples were logged, sealed, and prepared for transport. The footage from the thermal unit was reviewed by the full team that morning, and according to every account of that viewing, the reaction in the room was one of complete and total silence. Nobody had words for what they were looking at, because what they were looking at did not fit any category they had been trained to work within, and that was only the beginning of the problem. The biological material collected at the site that morning was unlike anything the Expedition Bigfoot team had previously recovered during their time in the field. The hair samples were long, coarse, and dark, with a thickness and texture that the collecting scientist noted immediately did not match any North American mammal in the reference catalog she was working from. The tissue sample was small, but intact enough to be considered viable for full genetic sequencing. Standard protocol required the samples to be transported to a certified laboratory within a specific window to preserve their integrity, and the team moved quickly to ensure that window was met. The samples left the field site within hours of collection and were transferred through a chain of custody that was documented at every step. The first laboratory to receive the material was a private facility with experience handling wildlife DNA analysis for both commercial and government clients. The initial processing took several days. When the preliminary results came back, the lead analyst on the case requested an internal review before releasing any findings to the production team. That request for an internal review was the first sign that something in the data was not straightforward. When the results were finally shared with the Expedition Bigfoot team, the language used to describe them was careful and heavily qualified. The genetic profile extracted from the samples did not match any species currently cataloged in the reference databases available to the laboratory. It shared certain markers with known primate genetic sequences, but the overall profile was sufficiently distinct that no confident taxonomic identification could be made. In plain terms, the DNA did not belong to anything science had formally documented. The production team requested that the samples be sent to a second independent laboratory for verification, without disclosing the findings from the first analysis. The second laboratory conducted its own sequencing independently and reached a conclusion that mirrored the first. Unknown genetic profile. Primate-adjacent markers, no match to any cataloged species. When the two sets of results were placed side by side and reviewed together, the scientist who had been brought in as a consultant reportedly went quiet for a long time before saying anything. What she eventually said was not captured on camera, but the people in that room when she said it have described the moment as the point where the atmosphere of the entire production shifted permanently. The question was no longer whether something had been on that ridge. The question was what that something was and what the existence of its DNA in a verified laboratory report was going to mean for everyone involved. The answer to that question came faster than anyone expected, and it did not come from the science. The timeline between the completion of the banned episode and its disappearance from the broadcast schedule is short, and the sequence of events within that timeline tells a story that is difficult to interpret as anything other than a deliberate and coordinated suppression. The episode was fully edited and delivered to the network in the standard post-production window. It was assigned an air date. Promotional materials were prepared. And then within a period of less than 2 weeks, everything stopped. The air date was quietly removed from the schedule. The promotional materials were pulled. Any reference to the episode in internal communications was systematically scrubbed. People who worked in the production office during that period have described a sudden and complete change in the energy surrounding the show. Conversations that had been open and enthusiastic became closed and careful. Certain topics became off-limits in ways that were never formally stated but were understood by everyone in the room. The cast members were not given a detailed explanation for why the episode was being shelved. They were told it was a production decision, that it was being reviewed, that more information would be provided when available. More information was never provided. What was provided instead were new non-disclosure agreements. Members of the production team who had been present during the filming of the banned episode and during the subsequent DNA analysis process were contacted individually and asked to sign updated legal documents that significantly expanded the scope of what they were prohibited from discussing publicly. The legal language in those documents was described by one former crew member as far more aggressive than anything they had encountered in a standard entertainment industry NDA. It covered not just the footage and the findings, but any conversations, observations, or personal impressions related to the expedition in question. The involvement of outside parties in the decision to pull the episode has never been officially confirmed, but the circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction is substantial. The speed with which legal documents were prepared and distributed suggests that the process was initiated by someone with significant resources and a clear sense of urgency. The network itself has never publicly addressed the missing episode. When pressed by fans and researchers in the years since its disappearance, the standard response has been a variation of no comment or a flat denial that any such episode exists. That denial has only deepened the suspicion of the research community, because the evidence that the episode was filmed, completed, and scheduled is substantial enough that the denial itself requires a level of institutional commitment that goes well beyond standard content management decisions. Something or someone wanted this buried, and they had the reach and the resources to make it happen. In the years since the banned episode disappeared from the broadcast schedule, a small number of individuals connected to the production have attempted to bring what they knew into the public domain. None of them got very far. The pattern that emerges when you look at these cases side by side is consistent enough to suggest that the suppression of this information did not end when the episode was shelved. It has been actively maintained ever since. The first credible attempt to go public came approximately 8 months after the episode was pulled. A former crew member who had been present during the filming and the subsequent DNA review began communicating with a researcher in the Bigfoot community who had been publicly asking questions about the missing episode. The initial exchanges were guarded but substantive. The crew member confirmed that the episode existed, that it had been completed, and that what had been captured during the filming was genuine and significant. They agreed to a recorded conversation. 2 days before that conversation was scheduled to take place, the crew member went silent. Their social media accounts were deleted. Attempts to reach them through mutual contacts went unanswered. The researcher who had been in communication with them has since stated publicly that they believe legal pressure was applied in the intervening period, but that they have no direct evidence to confirm it. A second incident occurred roughly 18 months later when a former post-production employee who had worked on the episode during editing made a series of posts on a now deleted account that described specific details of the footage and the DNA findings in terms that were consistent with what other sources had been saying privately. The posts generated significant attention within the Bigfoot research community before being deleted within 48 hours of going up. The account itself was removed shortly after. The former employee has never publicly reappeared under any identifiable name or account. A third and more recent attempt involved a former consultant connected to the laboratory that processed the initial DNA samples. This individual gave a partial interview to an independent researcher in which they confirmed that anomalous results had been produced from samples connected to a wildlife documentary production, but declined to be more specific. When the researcher attempted to follow up for a second conversation, the consultant stated that they had been advised not to continue and ended all communication. Each of these cases follows the same arc: initial contact, partial disclosure, sudden and complete silence. The timing in every instance suggests external intervention rather than a change of heart, and the consistency of the pattern across multiple individuals over multiple years points to something more organized than a network simply hoping an embarrassing production decision would be forgotten. The story of how the banned episode finally began making its way into the public domain is itself a story of patience, persistence, and a single decision made by someone who had apparently reached the end of their willingness to stay quiet. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way these things typically happen when powerful interests are working to contain them, in fragments, across multiple platforms, through channels that were difficult to trace back to a single source. The first piece of verifiable information to surface publicly was not footage at all. It was a description, a detailed written account posted anonymously to a forum frequented by serious Bigfoot researchers that laid out the basic sequence of events from the expedition with a level of specificity that immediately distinguished it from the speculation and rumor that had been circulating for years. Dates, location details, equipment designations, references to specific team dynamics during the filming, the kind of granular detail that could only have come from someone who was actually there. The post was copied and shared widely before it was taken down, and the copies that survived became the foundation on which subsequent investigations were built. Several months after that initial post, a short clip of what was described as thermal footage began circulating through private channels within the research community. The clip was low resolution, apparently captured from a screen rather than exported directly from the original file, but what it showed was consistent with everything that had been described in the anonymous written account: a large bipedal heat signature moving through dense forest. The clip lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was enough to shift the conversation from rumor to something that demanded a more serious response. Attempts to have the clip authenticated were complicated by its quality, but two independent analysts who reviewed it stated that nothing in the footage was inconsistent with a genuine thermal imaging recording and that the signature it showed did not match any known animal. The production company issued a statement in response to the circulating clip that neither confirmed nor denied its authenticity, but described the sharing of proprietary production materials as a potential legal violation. That statement was notable for what it did not say. It did not say the footage was fabricated. It did not say it was from a different production. It addressed the distribution of the material without making any claim about what the material actually was. To many in the research community, that carefully worded non-denial was more revealing than an outright confirmation would have been. In the months that followed, additional details continued to surface through a network of sources that appeared to be coordinating without being directly connected to one another. Descriptions of the DNA findings, accounts of the internal reaction when the results came back, details about the NDA process and the identity of the legal firm involved. The full picture assembled itself slowly, but the direction it pointed was consistent from the beginning. Something real had been captured on that ridge, and the effort to keep it contained was larger and more deliberate than anyone outside the production had previously understood. The response from the broader research community to the surfaced footage and the DNA claims associated with the banned episode has been anything but unified, and that division is itself worth examining closely because it reflects a tension that has existed within the Bigfoot research world for as long as the field has existed. On one side are the researchers and investigators who look at the totality of what has surfaced and conclude that the evidence is too specific, too consistent, and too corroborated across too many independent sources to be dismissed. These are not fringe voices. Several of the individuals who have spoken most forcefully about the credibility of the banned episode material have decades of field experience and academic credentials that would earn them a hearing in any serious scientific context. Their argument is straightforward. The thermal footage is consistent with previous high-credibility Bigfoot thermal events in terms of size, movement pattern, and heat signature distribution. The DNA findings, while extraordinary, follow a pattern that has appeared in previous serious Bigfoot DNA investigations, where samples produced genetic profiles that could not be matched to any known species. And the behavior of the network and production company in response to the surfaced material, specifically the careful legal language and the deliberate avoidance of any direct denial, suggests an institutional awareness that the material is genuine and that making false claims about it in a public forum carries legal risk. On the other side are researchers and skeptics who believe the entire story has the structure of a sophisticated content strategy rather than a genuine whistleblower situation. Their argument centers on timing and incentive. The surfacing of the footage and the steady drip of corroborating detail creates exactly the kind of sustained audience engagement that benefits a production looking to generate interest in a new season or a streaming deal. The anonymity of the primary sources makes independent verification impossible, and the DNA claims, while compelling in their specificity, cannot be evaluated directly because the samples and the laboratory reports have never been made available for independent review. What remains when you strip away both the belief and the skepticism is a set of questions that the available evidence cannot yet answer definitively. Was what was captured on that ridge a genuine Bigfoot encounter of a magnitude that has never been documented on camera before? Was the suppression of the episode a response to genuine scientific findings that powerful interests could not afford to become public? Or is the entire arc of this story, from the filming to the burial to the surfacing of the footage, something that was shaped at every stage by hands more interested in audience metrics than in the truth? The honest answer is that nobody outside a very small circle of people knows for certain, and that circle has been remarkably effective at staying quiet. The banned episode still exists somewhere, and the people who know the truth are running out of reasons to stay quiet. ND. Days do not last forever, and the pressure on the network to address this story is growing by the day. The research community is not letting this go. More details are surfacing, and the full footage is closer to the public than it has ever been. The only question left is who breaks first. And when they do, nothing will ever be the same for this show or this investigation.